first of all. My name is Rashed Idrees. I'm with DFDL, which is a legal and tax firm in Cambodia and throughout Indochina. I want to start by, first of all, thanking His Excellency for gracing this event, for supporting this event, and also providing this very helpful guidance in how we might do this event. So thank you very much, Excellency. I also take this opportunity to thank the UK-TI and UK-ASEAN, and in particular Helen Etheridge over here and her colleagues on this initiative, and also for inviting us to participate and talk. As His Excellency mentioned, I've just literally flown in from Singapore. That's a 14-hour journey, and there's an 8-hour time difference, so some of my colleagues have rather unkindly commented that when I speak normally I end up putting the audience to sleep, but there's every chance I'll put myself to sleep today instead. Perhaps we could start with, I thought I'd start with a few words about DFDL and who we are and where we are. So that's a sort of geographical footprint. We started out in Indochina, in Cambodia and Lao and Myanmar. Here are some more facts and figures on us. Our founding partners, I think there were 4 of them, and 2 of them were from California. So obviously this is back in the early 90s. So one wonders what they were smoking at that time. But they decided that, notwithstanding civil war raging through Indochina, we should have a law firm there. Legal services were required, so they went in and set up in Lao in '94, Cambodia in '95. We've been in Myanmar for 18 years, and outreach from there essentially. Not to bore you too much about us, but that's basically our setup. We're a full-service legal and tax firm. And again, the tax aspect is quite important and quite unique. Any kind of investment in Indochina will require both legal structuring as well as tax structuring. And that's actually quite important right at the outset. Unlike more developed jurisdictions where perhaps you can go along and play around with things later on down the line, you don't really have that luxury in Indochina. You need to make sure you have your ducks in a row, both legally and tax-wise, from the outset, pretty much on every investment you're thinking of in those jurisdictions. And that applies especially for Cambodia. There's a mention of Asian desk at the bottom. It says China desk, India desk, Japan desk. Just to explain, we're not talking about holding the hands of foreign clients going into any of those jurisdictions. We're talking about outbound investment from those jurisdictions into our jurisdictions of expertise, including in Cambodia. So that's essentially us playing to our strengths. And what we'd like to add to that, obviously, is to have a UK desk as well, hopefully in the not too distant future. So moving on to Cambodia. We've heard a lot about the natural resources already from His Excellency in Malap. The only thing I'll add to that is that we act for pretty much all of the large players in offshore Block A, both the operators and the contractors, and they wouldn't be there spending the money that they're spending if in fact there were not proven reserves. So they're obviously there for the long haul. That's a very good indication indeed. In fact, one of them, the largest, has just made a massive investment, and that more than anything I think is indicative of what's available, what the opportunities are. The only other thing I'd mention here is generally on the mining side, we've gone from about 5 mining companies just over 5 years ago to more than 75 today. We've got production of bauxite, we've got production of gold, copper, and it's one of the industries that simply exploded. The Ministry of Mines and Energy has been so inundated with mining license concessions and applications that they had to set up a separate department just to deal with it. So again, that's a very good indication of, in terms of natural resources, what is the flavor of the day and where most of the foreign investment is going to. I don't think I should talk too much about the economic data, given we've had an expert already talk about economic data and His Excellency's numbers as well. Suffice it to say, ours are somewhere in between. We've heard of 7.5 and we got a 6.2, and we're somewhere between 6.7 and 7, if I'm not mistaken. but that's the growth forecast for this year. The point is that we've been growing pretty much year on year. The only blip was in 2009 because of the worldwide recession and as it impacted ASEAN. Economic climate generally, again, we've heard from the experts. The only thing I would touch on here are the sectors to watch where we've seen considerable increase in foreign investment. We've heard of agribusiness. I think Malala touched on some issues to do with the land. Yes, indeed, those land titles were wiped out in the Civil War, as you'd expect. However, the level of investment in agribusiness is phenomenal, and it's grown exponentially the last 5 years. We've seen investors from Japan, from China, from India, from Canada, from the US. The margins are actually quite significant, and the levels of investment have been considerable. Mining we've spoken about, banks and MFIs. Again, on the banking side, Malala also touched on Akita Bank and what they've been up to. The fact of the matter is a lot of the foreign banks that were there initially and had their licenses and then sort of watered down to a more representative office status are now coming back in force and are paying considerably more for those licenses than they originally would have. That's again an indication of where that market is going. In terms of financial services and products, they've become a lot more sophisticated and developed. And the largest foreign-owned bank there is the ANZ Royal. And certainly in terms of their programs, the types of financial products they've tried to introduce into the market, it's become a lot more sophisticated over the course of the last few years. We're talking things like, for example, trade finance initiatives, Red Clause LCs, Green Clause LCs, export finance, pre-export finance, for the first time being looked at, which also gels quite well with the garment export industry, as you'd appreciate. And generally, in terms of consumer products as well, they've become a lot more sophisticated, and I think the trend is to continue in a similar vein. So I'm the lawyer here, so as you would have noticed, given that the first thing I did was leave my business cards on all of your chairs. But to talk briefly about the Cambodian legal framework, if we look at the period 1995 to 2005, we're talking about the aftermath of civil war. Those are the initial 10 years. So naturally, you can expect a lot of discrepancies and issues. Lack of law in key areas, of course, and therefore we have these uncertainties and grey zones. Governmental discretion was wide, and therefore we have had implementation issues. Non-enforcement of laws and regulations. Generally, the court systems were poor. They were recovering from civil war. Many of the judges that were appointed perhaps weren't the best at doing what they were appointed to do, and generally it was a lack of transparency. So what's changed since then? Actually, quite a lot. His Excellency touched on the WTO accession. That's changed things quite a bit. One of the most significant developments has been the number of new laws that have been implemented in a very short space of time. In the last 5 years, Cambodia has implemented more new laws and substantive new laws than any other country in the world. One of those laws that's mentioned there is the Civil Code, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail, but essentially it's changed the legal and regulatory landscape for civil laws in Cambodia. All those grey areas and uncertainties we had before have been replaced with, frankly, international principles, common law principles that we might be familiar with in England and Wales, or in Australia and other countries like that. And in terms of the concepts, legal concepts, contract, offer, acceptance, all the basic fundamentals that we take for granted in more developed jurisdictions, we now have certainty on for the first time in Cambodia. So the Civil Code, 10 years in the making, is frankly, it's a game changer. And along with that, we've got generally greater transparency, we've got more internationalized standards wherever you look. I mentioned mining. Because of the explosion in mining, you go to the Ministry of Mines and Energy now. The contracts that they enter into, or would look to enter into with any potential investor in the mining sector, looks like something you would get in Western Australia. 5 years ago, it looked like something you'd really want to just cry over. So again, huge strides in a very short space of time. Again, being the lawyer, I'll just touch briefly on enforcement issues. Foreign companies coming in, they're contracting with a Cambodian counterparty. How do you do it? What's your governing law? What's your dispute resolution mechanism? Well, simply put, if you have a foreign governing law, combined with submission to foreign courts, there's every danger your Cambodian counterparty will run to a Cambodian court and ask them to assume jurisdiction. And they probably will. And if they do, then they will only apply Cambodian law and not the foreign law that you contracted for. So the magic formula at this point in time, and has been for the last 2 or 3 years, is to have, yes, foreign governing law, very often English law, as is quite common in South Asia and other parts of Southeast Asia, combined with foreign arbitration, submission to foreign arbitration, usually under the SIAC rules, usually in Singapore. Political endorsement, as His Excellency would probably also mention, is that it's come straight from the Prime Minister that where you have a binding arbitration agreement for foreign arbitration, no Cambodian court is to assume jurisdiction, notwithstanding whoever the Cambodian counterparty might be. That has been followed to the letter. Cambodia is a signatory to the 58 New York Convention, and in fact, even as I speak right now, there is a case that's coming to its conclusion. It is the first enforcement of a foreign arbitral award in Cambodia. It has not involved any retrying of the case, retrying or re-examination of the merits. It has been a straightforward enforcement procedure as per the black letter law. Courts haven't opened it up, there's been no witnesses or anything of that nature. It is an enforcement proceeding. It's a watershed moment for Cambodia, and we're nearly there, essentially. There have been other foreign arbitral awards that have been won abroad, and they were on their way back to Cambodia, but for one reason or another, the Cambodian counterparty turned around and said, well, wait a minute, I don't want you to do that. I have assets in Singapore or Hong Kong. Let's settle this elsewhere. Let's not bring the award in. So I think that was already, if you like, a good indication that, in fact, it does work. Okay, and along with that, generally, in terms of the local arbitration setup, the local arbitration center, the arbitrators we have on the ground, it's there. It's in process, and this initiative, this initiative generally has been going on for a couple of years, and we've seen significant progress. The arbitration laws in Cambodia also look pretty good at the moment, so that'll be another option perhaps for smaller sized contracts where foreigners are concerned in the not too distant future. I mentioned generally the civil code. I won't bore you with too many details. Suffice it to say, internationally understood legal concepts, principles, transparency, clarity, and certainty are essentially the hallmarks of the civil code, and for the first time ever in Cambodia. Again, these are some of the provisions that deal with fundamental aspects of contract law, tort law, etc. I'm not going to go into those sorts of details, but I will just touch a little bit on the security aspects. For foreign investors going into Cambodia, they need to obviously secure their interests themselves or be involved in a project that's going to be financed and therefore bankable. So it's kind of fundamental to ensure that you've got the right security package, security structures, and that they work. So at this moment in time, with the civil code, the secure transactions law, which I'll also touch on, you can essentially take security over anything. Movable, immovable property, tangible, intangible. And the very same concepts and principles that some of us here might be familiar with, let's say from an English law perspective, are very much the order of the day in Cambodia under these new laws as well. It's understandable, it's enforceable. In fact, some of it is a little bit more even advanced in some of the more developed jurisdictions. For example, under the new secure transactions law, you can register security online. This is Cambodia we're talking about, and you can register security online. That's quite an achievement, I think. Again, I won't get into too many details of the commercial contracts law. Suffice it to say, this supplements what's going on with the civil code and generally the laws and developments as we see them in terms of making things more internationally transparent and clear and sophisticated. Anti-corruption, no one's really touched on that yet. I was a little bit surprised by that. A lot of the companies we deal with have very severe CPA requirements, UK FATF requirements, anti-money laundering issues, etc. Cambodia's come an extremely long way in a very short period of time in this area as well. The new anti-corruption regime was just introduced, I think, just a couple of years ago. It is as detailed and as sophisticated as anything the FCPA was introduced as. And by the way, with the FCPA, it took about 6 years for anyone to notice it. With the anti-corruption regime in Cambodia, they've started noticing it almost immediately and started implementing it over the last 2 years. What that has meant, essentially, is quite a change, quite a shift. A lot of it is more optical. Just to explain. Historically, before we had these anti-corruption laws, what made Cambodia bottom of the charts in terms of corruption rankings was the fact that there were no official receipts given. You would go to a government department, or you'd go to a government ministry, and you'd pay a fee, usually quite a reasonable fee, for a reasonable service, but you wouldn't get a receipt. So that was classified as institutionalized corruption. The difference with this anti-corruption regime is, in addition to these detailed provisions and, again, being very different and more sophisticated, is you have an official schedule of fees, you get official receipts. But the surprising thing is, or perhaps it's not surprising, what you pay for the service and the receipt that you're given and what it reflects is exactly the same as it was before we had the anti-corruption regime. So it's still the same fee for the same service, except you get a receipt for it now. And all of a sudden, because of that, Cambodia will move drastically up the rankings in those tables that I mentioned, because of this system in place. But it is, nonetheless, a huge development, and again, as part of the overall development of Cambodia in terms of evolving its legal landscape, obviously it's addressed the anti-corruption aspects as well, and I think that we'll see a year-on-year improvement in terms of rankings for Cambodia, generally on anti-corruption and money laundering. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about all the new laws. As I mentioned, we've got more new laws than any other country in the world in the last 5 years. And these aren't subsidiary or collateral legislation or regulations or rules. These are really substantive laws, such as the Civil Code, that are essentially game changers. That put the legal system on the map again in Cambodia after what's been a difficult time immediately after the Civil War, and that's resulted in exponential change, particularly over the last 5 or 7 years. General commercial considerations. Well, being a lawyer here, the first thing I'm going to say to you is obviously, if you're looking to do business in Cambodia, you need to make sure you do a proper due diligence, you need to make sure you have the proper legal structure, you need to make sure you have the proper tax structuring done as well, and of course we can help you with all of that and to get that plug in. But on a more serious note, in terms of legal and tax structuring, that is actually quite fundamental. Some of the issues that even Malala touched on, for example, land. When you're dealing with land in Cambodia, it is a world away from what you might be used to in more developed jurisdictions, particularly in England and Wales. We have lost a lot of those titles, and we need to essentially have other techniques to protect foreign investors in terms of their ownership rights and usage rights in terms of real property. And so structures have been developed and refined over the last 4 or 5 years, many of which I have to say that we've been responsible for, and working with the land ministries and others to make sure that we've developed structures that actually work for foreign investors. So there may be many instances where, yes, you can take a 99-year lease, but do you have the nature and quality of the rights that afford you to do what you need to do for those 99 years, or however long you want to do the project for? That's actually a difficult question, and one that needs to be looked at quite meaningfully. Similarly, if you're involved in any kind of ownership of real property, you've got to have the correct structures in place that allow you to exercise all the rights of the owner, while at the same time, on paper, appearing as essentially a minority, not a majority. So these aren't quite the same as nominee structures that some of you might be familiar with, for example, in Indonesia or Thailand or Vietnam. These are a little bit different. They have a peculiarly Cambodian twist. And it's a lot to do with the titles and the history of land and property and real property in Cambodia. So generally in terms of business forum, obviously you look at specific licenses and approvals, but on the whole it's a relatively easy place to do business. There aren't that many licenses and rules we're talking about. It's not Vietnam, it's not Thailand. And certainly these nominee structures, they work and they've essentially been politically endorsed. I'm going to leave you with this table to look at. It's just the sort of pros and cons of the types of business entities that you would look to set up. Without going into too many details, suffice it to say, most foreign investors coming in to do any sort of meaningful business in Cambodia would set up a limited liability company, so the equivalent here in the UK is a private limited company. And that's simply because the other forms are more limited in terms of what you're able to do in terms of your business and operations on the ground in Cambodia. There are also different tax implications and others. So, to sum up, we've heard many positive things from His Excellency and indeed from Malala. You've heard a lot from me. Certainly the WTO accession and the way that's going has had a significant impact. The new legal regime and laws, regulations over the last 5 years have been simply a game changer in terms of foreign investment. The new sectors we see that have grown, and we see foreign investors coming in on a fairly hefty basis: agribusiness, telecoms, infrastructure, mining, natural resources. These are all huge growth areas. Tourism as well, property. And faced with all of that, there are implementation issues, there are judicial, legal issues, but we seem to be going at quite a steady pace in terms of resolving those at the same time as we see FDI increasing. And from a personal perspective, and from a DFDL firm perspective, we work in most of the countries in the region. And if I take a look around and I look at Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia, those are kind of difficult places to do business right now. There are a lot of issues, there's a lot of bureaucracy, not a lot of the nominee structures that foreign investors have gone in with are now being questioned. In comparison, Cambodia, the political will is there, the flexibility is there, because they're still in a developmental state that allows for those, that allows for a degree of flexibility, and generally because of the incentives provided to foreign investors and generally the welcome. At this point in time, I'd have to say, looking at the region that we deal with, Cambodia is probably the #1 country for foreign investors to look at right now. And I think I should probably end on that note. Thank you very much.